January 23rd, 1944, Camp Forest, Tennessee, United States. The paintbrush froze in Private First Class Jack Maisie's hand as he stared at the notice pinned to the barracks bulletin board. The United States Army was recruiting for a new special operations unit, not soldiers who could shoot straight, not paratroopers or demolition experts. They needed artists, designers, set builders, sound engineers, men who could create illusions, not destroy enemies. Macy, a young designer from New York who had spent his pre-war days sketching advertisements for Madison Avenue, thought it was a joke. It wasn't. The notice was deadly serious, and it would lead to the creation of the most audacious military deception in human history, a phantom army of 150,000 men that existed only in the imagination of its creators, yet would help change the course of World War II. What Macy couldn't know as he read that notice was that he and 1,100 other carefully selected men were about to become the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unit so secret that its existence wouldn't be declassified for 52 years. They would become known by another name, whispered in hushed tones by the few who knew of their work, the Ghost Army. Their mission to convince Adolf Hitler and his high command that the Allied invasion of Europe would strike at Pas-de-Calais, 150 miles northeast of the real target, Normandy. They would do this not with bullets or bombs, but with inflatable rubber tanks, fake radio transmissions, and theatrical props that would make Broadway jealous. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the deception failed, if German panzer divisions weren't drawn away from Normandy, the beaches of France would become a killing ground for Allied forces. Tens of thousands would die in the surf. The invasion would fail. The war would drag on for years. Everything depended on whether a handful of artists and designers could fool the most sophisticated military intelligence apparatus in the world. And it all began with men like Jack Maisy, standing in a Tennessee barracks wondering if he had just read the strangest recruitment notice in military history. He had no way of knowing that the paintbrush in his hand would become a weapon more powerful than any rifle, that his artistic talent would save thousands of lives, that history would remember him and his fellow Ghost Army soldiers, not for the enemies they killed, but for the illusions they created. The notice on that bulletin board was recruiting performers for the greatest show on Earth, and the audience would be the Wehrmacht High Command itself. The Ghost Army didn't look like soldiers. When the 100 men assembled at Camp Pine, New York in early 1944, they looked like they had wandered off a Hollywood movie set, and in many cases they had among their ranks fashion designers from Parisian studios, window dressers from Fifth Avenue department stores, painters who had exhibited in New York galleries, actors from regional theater companies, sound technicians from radio stations, and set builders from Broadway productions. The youngest was 19, the oldest 43. None of them knew exactly why they had been selected, only that their orders were classified top secret, and that they were about to embark on training unlike anything the U.S. Army had ever attempted. Their commanding officer, Colonel Harry L. Reeder, gathered them in a drafty warehouse on their first day and explained their mission with characteristic bluntness. Gentlemen, you're going to learn how to lie. You are going to learn how to lie so convincingly that the German army will believe you, and if you lie well enough, you will save thousands of American lives. The training was surreal. Instead of bayonet practice, they learned how to inflate rubber tanks using air compressors. Instead of weapons drills, they studied how to mimic radio transmission patterns of actual combat units. Instead of marksmanship, they practiced applying camouflage paint to make plywood airplanes look authentic from 10,000 feet. The Ghost Army was divided into 4 specialized units, each with a unique deception capability. The 603rd Camouflage Engineering Battalion handled visual deception. The inflatable tanks, rubber trucks, fake artillery pieces. These weren't cheap carnival balloons. Each inflatable M4 Sherman tank weighed 93 pounds when deflated, required 4 men to inflate using portable air compressors, and featured meticulously hand-painted details down to the fake serial numbers and weathering effects. From ground level, up close, they looked ridiculous. Floppy rubber shells that could be punctured with a knife, but from 5,000 feet in the air, photographed by Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes, they were indistinguishable from real armor. The 3132 Signal Service Company specialized in sonic deception. They possessed something extraordinary. Recordings of actual military operations captured on state-of-the-art wire recorders, the sounds of tank columns moving at night, trucks grinding gears up muddy hills, soldiers shouting orders during equipment setup, bridge construction crews hammering pontoons into place. These recordings would be played through specially designed sound trucks equipped with massive speakers that could project audio across 15 miles of countryside. A single sound truck could simulate an entire armored division on the move. The signal company special handled radio deception, perhaps the most delicate art of all. German signals intelligence could identify individual radio operators by their unique transmission patterns, the way they tapped out Morse code, the rhythm of their dots and dashes. It was as distinctive as a fingerprint. So Ghost Army radio operators didn't just send fake messages. They studied and perfectly mimicked the transmission styles of real units, creating the radio signature of entire divisions that existed only on the airwaves. The 406th Engineer Combat Company Special provided security and logistics. Their job was mundane but critical. Establish perimeters, prevent civilian contact with operations, handle construction and teardown. Because the most elaborate illusion in the world fails if a French farmer wanders past your perimeter and watches 4 GIs pick up a 40-ton tank and carry it by hand, which actually happened more than once. By April 1944, the Ghost Army was ready. They boarded transport ships at New York Harbor and sailed for England, where they would rehearse their greatest performance, Operation Fortitude, the deception campaign designed to convince Hitler that the D-Day invasion would target Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy. They arrived at their staging area near Stratford-upon-Avon, Shakespeare country. The irony wasn't lost on the artists and actors among them. They were about to stage a production that would have impressed the bard himself. All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. Except in this production, the audience was the German Wehrmacht, and the stakes were life or death. May 1944, Dover and Folkestone, England. Operation Fortitude entered its final phase. Along the white cliffs overlooking the English Channel toward Pas-de-Calais, the Ghost Army began constructing the first United States Army Group, FUSAG, a massive invasion force that would never fire a shot because it didn't actually exist. The inflatable tanks came first. Working under cover of darkness, Ghost Army teams unrolled the rubber shells from trucks and attached portable air compressors. The night air filled with the absurd sound of whooshing air as fake Shermans, Grants, and tank destroyers inflated like children's pool toys. It took approximately 15 minutes to fully inflate a single tank. By dawn, the fields and staging areas around Dover contained what appeared to be hundreds of armored vehicles arranged in precise military formation. The attention to detail was obsessive. Each tank received hand-painted mud splatters, oil stains, track marks, and weathering effects. Crew members painted fake unit insignia matching real divisions supposedly stationed nearby. They scattered appropriate debris around each vehicle, empty fuel cans, discarded ration boxes, cigarette butts, tire tracks pressed into the mud using real tank treads dragged by trucks. From ground level, the deception was fragile. The rubber tanks wobbled in strong wind. They reflected sunlight differently than steel, but the Ghost Army wasn't concerned with ground observers. They were performing for an audience at 20,000 feet, Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft that photographed the English coast daily, feeding intelligence back to German high command. To supplement the inflatable armor, set builders constructed plywood aircraft, entire squadrons of B-17 bombers and P-47 fighters arranged on fake airfields. These weren't elaborate. At close range, they looked like high school theater props, but aerial photography rendered them credible. To create the illusion of activity at night, teams of soldiers dragged headlamps across the fake runways, simulating taxiing aircraft. The Germans photographed the lights. They believed what they saw. The sonic deception was equally elaborate. Every night, sound trucks positioned in carefully calculated locations would play recordings of military activity, the sounds of armored columns moving towards the coast, supply convoys grinding through narrow village streets, engineering battalions constructing temporary bridges over streams. The recordings weren't played loudly enough to attract local attention. They were calibrated for German listening posts across the channel in Calais, exactly 21 miles away. German intelligence officers hearing these sounds confirmed what their aerial reconnaissance showed: massive forces gathering opposite Pas-de-Calais. But the masterstroke of Operation Fortitude wasn't the props or sound effects. It was psychological warfare built on German assumptions. The Allies placed General George S. Patton in command of the Phantom Fusag. Patton, the General German High Command, feared most, the man they believed was America's finest tactical commander. The logic was irresistible. Wherever Patton was, that's where the invasion would strike. So the Allies deliberately leaked Patton's location. They allowed German agents in England to photograph him inspecting the fake army near Dover. They ensured radio intercepts mentioned his name. They had him give public speeches in the Dover area that were reported in newspapers German intelligence would see. Patton himself understood the deception and played his role perfectly, appearing at fake headquarters, touring fake installations, behaving in every way like a commander preparing for invasion. In reality, Patton had no role in D-Day, but German intelligence didn't know that. The combination of visual, sonic, and psychological deception created layers of confirmation. German aerial reconnaissance photographed massive forces. German listening posts heard those forces preparing for deployment. German spies reported Patton commanding those forces. And double agents working for the Allies but trusted by the Germans sent radio messages confirming everything. The Germans couldn't know that the Allies had cracked Enigma and other German encryption systems. They couldn't know that British intelligence monitored their communications in real time, reading their assessments, confirming that the deception was working. German intelligence reports from May 1944 concluded with high confidence that the invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais in mid-July. They positioned 15 divisions there, including powerful panzer units held in reserve, waiting for an invasion that would never come. On June 5th, 1944, as real Allied forces prepared to storm Normandy beaches, German commanders at Pas-de-Calais continued watching empty horizons, guarding against the Ghost Army assembled across the Channel. The greatest military deception in history was working. The Ghost Army's Phantom divisions had drawn German forces exactly where the Allies needed them, far away from the actual invasion beaches. When the real invasion launched at Normandy on June 6th, German commanders hesitated to commit reserves from Pas-de-Calais, convinced that Normandy was a feint, that the real invasion was still coming at Calais, where Patton's massive force waited. They hesitated for days. Those days made the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Thousands of Allied soldiers who would have died on Normandy beaches lived because German reinforcements stayed in Calais, waiting for ghosts. The artists, designers, and sound engineers of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had accomplished something extraordinary. They had weaponized illusion. They had turned theater into strategy. They had proven that in modern warfare, deception could be as powerful as firepower, and they had saved countless lives without firing a single shot. June 20th, 1944, Normandy, France. 2 weeks after D-Day, the Ghost Army crossed the English Channel not as observers, but as active participants in the campaign. Their war was just beginning. The Normandy beachhead remained precarious. Allied forces had penetrated inland but faced fierce German resistance. Every day, Luftwaffe bombers and long-range artillery targeted critical infrastructure, especially the Mulberry harbors, the massive artificial ports the Allies had constructed to supply their forces. These harbors were essential. Lose them, and the invasion could still fail. The Ghost Army received an urgent assignment: protect the real Mulberry harbors by creating fake ones elsewhere to draw German fire. Working at night under blackout conditions, Ghost Army crews assembled one of their most ambitious illusions, using lights arranged to mimic the distinctive pattern of Mulberry harbor installations. They created decoy ports several miles from the actual locations. The lights suggested intense activity: ships offloading, cranes operating, supply convoys forming. The deception worked exactly as planned. German bombers and artillery targeted the fake harbors. Bombs fell harmlessly into empty water. Artillery shells devastated positions where nothing existed. Meanwhile, the real Mulberry harbors continued operations as undisturbed, pumping thousands of tons of supplies ashore daily. The Ghost Army had proven their value in combat conditions. As Allied forces pushed east across France, the 23rd moved with them, conducting what they called their traveling road show, a series of tactical deceptions designed to confuse German intelligence about Allied strength, positions, and intentions. In late August, they staged one of their most successful operations near Brest. A relatively small Allied force had encircled the port city, besieging German defenders. The Ghost Army made that small force appear enormous. They inflated hundreds of rubber tanks in the surrounding countryside. They broadcast radio traffic suggesting multiple divisions converging on Brest. Their sound trucks played recordings of massive troop movements and artillery preparations. German defenders inside Brest, monitoring Allied communications and observing positions through binoculars, concluded they faced overwhelming force. They surrendered more quickly than expected, convinced that resistance was futile against such massive Allied numbers. In reality, the Ghost Army had multiplied Allied strength through pure illusion. The actual besieging force was a fraction of what German commanders believed they faced. But the performance was convincing enough to save weeks of fighting and thousands of casualties on both sides. The techniques refined at Brest became the Ghost Army's standard playbook: inflate rubber equipment in realistic formations, generate appropriate radio traffic mimicking real units, play sonic recordings calibrated for enemy listening posts, leave appropriate physical evidence like vehicle tracks and supply dumps, and let German intelligence draw its own conclusions. The deception worked because it exploited how military intelligence functions. Analysts look for confirming evidence from multiple sources. When aerial reconnaissance, radio intercepts, and acoustic detection all agree, the conclusion seems unassailable. The Ghost Army gave German intelligence exactly what it expected to find, and German intelligence confirmed the illusion. By September 1944, the 23rd had conducted successful operations across France. They had simulated armored divisions that didn't exist, drawn enemy fire to empty positions, convinced German commanders to commit reserves to defend against phantom attacks, and allowed real Allied forces to maneuver with reduced opposition. But their most important work still lay ahead. As autumn arrived and Allied forces approached the German border, the Ghost Army prepared for their role in two of the war's most critical operations, the Battle of the Bulge and the Rhine River crossings. The Ghost Army established their base in Luxembourg, a small nation positioned at the critical junction where American, British, and German forces converged. From here, they would conduct deceptions along the Siegfried Line in the Hürtgen Forest and eventually along the Rhine itself. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Unlike their operations in England, where they performed in relative safety behind front lines, the Ghost Army now operated in combat zones. German artillery could hit their positions. Enemy patrols could stumble onto their installations. The inflatable tanks and fake equipment that seemed absurd in peaceful English fields took on grim significance in active war zones. If discovered, they would reveal the deception and put real Allied units at risk. The men of the 23rd adapted to combat conditions. They learned to set up and tear down operations rapidly. They established security perimeters and developed protocols for what to do if enemy forces approached during an operation, and they maintained absolute operational security in towns and villages behind Allied lines. Ghost Army soldiers couldn't discuss their work, couldn't mention their unit designation, couldn't hint at the deceptions they staged. The official cover story was that they were a mobile headquarters unit providing communication support. It was boring and unmemorable, which made it perfect. In the rare moments of downtime, Ghost Army soldiers did what artists do. They created sketchbooks filled with drawings of French countryside, watercolors of destroyed villages, charcoal portraits of fellow soldiers. Some of these artists would become famous after the war. Art Kane would become one of America's most celebrated photographers. Ellsworth Kelly would become a major abstract expressionist painter. Bill Blass would build a fashion empire. But in 1944, they were soldiers engaged in one of the war's strangest missions, professional liars serving their country by perfecting the art of deception. As winter approached and the German army prepared its last desperate offensive in the Ardennes, the Ghost Army would face their greatest test yet. See December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. German forces launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, the massive surprise offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. 3 German armies, 200,000 men, and 1,000 tanks smashed through thinly held American positions in a desperate bid to split Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp. The offensive created chaos. American units were surrounded, communication lines cut, entire sectors of the front collapsing. In the confusion and fog of war, the Ghost Army received urgent orders: conduct deception operations to confuse German intelligence about American strength and positions while real combat units regrouped and counterattacked. This was different from every previous Ghost Army operation. Before, they had conducted deceptions far from actual combat, staging illusions to mislead German intelligence at strategic levels. Now they would operate in an active battlefield with German forces advancing rapidly and Allied forces in desperate retreat. The stakes were immediate and personal. If they failed, if their deceptions were discovered, German forces might exploit the gaps and break through completely. The Ghost Army split into multiple teams, each conducting separate deceptions across the collapsing front. Their mission was to create confusion, to make German commanders uncertain about American positions, to simulate strength where there was weakness, and to draw German forces toward fake positions and away from real Allied units desperately trying to establish defensive lines. Near Bastogne, as the 101st Airborne Division became surrounded and cut off, Ghost Army teams staged deceptions suggesting that relief forces were arriving from multiple directions. They broadcast radio traffic indicating armored divisions approaching, played sound recordings of tank columns on the move, and created false radio nets suggesting massive reinforcements converging on the surrounded paratroopers. The deception had a specific goal: make German forces hesitant to commit everything to overrunning Bastogne. If they believed American reinforcements were imminent, they might pause, might consolidate positions instead of attacking immediately. Every hour of German hesitation was an hour for real American forces, including Patton's actual Third Army, racing north to reach the surrounded defenders. The deception worked partially. German forces attacking Bastogne reported encountering what they believed were elements of American armored divisions. Some units delayed attacks to prepare for confrontation with non-existent tanks. The delays bought time, and time was what the 101st Airborne desperately needed. Meanwhile, other Ghost Army teams conducted what would become one of their most audacious operations. As American forces retreated from the initial German breakthrough, the 23rd staged a massive deception, simulating two entire divisions holding defensive positions along the Meuse River. They inflated hundreds of rubber tanks, created elaborate fake headquarters installations, generated intense radio traffic, and played continuous sound effects of large forces digging in and preparing defenses. The illusion was designed to make German commanders believe that strong American forces blocked the route to their objectives. If the Germans believed two divisions defended the Meuse crossings, they might redirect their offensive, might search for weaker points, might commit forces to battles against phantom defenders. German intelligence took the bait. Reconnaissance reports identified strong American positions along the Meuse. Radio intercepts confirmed the presence of major units. German commanders adjusted their plans, redirecting forces and postponing attacks on what they believed were strongly defended positions. In reality, those positions were held by minimal forces, backed by rubber tanks and sound trucks. But the Germans didn't know that. They probed cautiously. They prepared elaborate attacks. They committed units to outflank positions held by ghosts, and every hour they spent preparing to fight illusions was an hour they weren't advancing toward their real objectives. The Battle of the Bulge raged through Christmas and into January. The Ghost Army conducted continuous operations throughout, moving between positions, setting up and tearing down deceptions, staying ahead of both advancing Germans and retreating Americans. It was the most dangerous work they had ever done. German patrols came within yards of discovering their installations. Artillery fire fell near their positions. Several times, Ghost Army units had to abandon operations and flee ahead of German advances, leaving deflated rubber tanks and sound equipment behind. Through it all, they maintained their deceptions, contributing to the confusion and uncertainty that plagued German planning. By early January, when the German offensive finally stalled and American counterattacks began pushing back, the Ghost Army had conducted more than a dozen separate deception operations across the Bulge battlefield. They had simulated entire divisions that didn't exist, drawn German forces toward empty positions, protected real American units during repositioning, and contributed to the chaos that prevented German forces from achieving their objectives. The men of the 23rd had operated under conditions they never trained for: active combat zones with minimal security, rapidly changing situations with incomplete intelligence, and constant danger of discovery or being overrun. They had proven that tactical deception could work even in the confusion of a major battle. That illusion could be a weapon even when the enemy was advancing and Allied forces were in retreat. But their greatest challenge still waited. As spring arrived and Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine River into Germany itself, The Ghost Army would stage their final and most elaborate performance of the war, March 1945, the Rhine River, Germany, the last major natural barrier protecting the German homeland. Allied forces had fought across France, Belgium, and into Western Germany, but the Rhine represented the final threshold. Once across, Allied armies would drive into the industrial heartland of the Third Reich. The crossing would be opposed. German forces held strong positions along the eastern bank. They had artillery pre-registered on likely crossing points. They had reserves positioned to counterattack any bridgehead. Intelligence estimated that a Rhine crossing would be among the bloodiest operations of the war. The Ghost Army received their mission: simulate major crossing operations at multiple locations to draw German forces away from the actual crossing sites. They would create the illusion of entire armies preparing to force the Rhine at several points, making German commanders divide their forces, commit reserves to defend against phantom attacks, and weaken the defenses at the real crossing points. The operation required unprecedented coordination. Ghost Army teams established positions at 4 separate locations along a 50-mile stretch of the Rhine. At each location, they created evidence of immense military preparation. They inflated hundreds of rubber tanks and artillery pieces arranged in assault formations. They constructed fake supply dumps, pontoon bridge assembly areas, and command posts. They generated massive radio traffic indicating units moving into position. They played sound recordings of engineering equipment preparing crossing sites. The deceptions had to be perfectly synchronized. If one location appeared too active too soon, German commanders might realize they were being deceived. Each phantom crossing needed to build credibly over days, creating the impression of methodical preparation that matched how real operations would unfold. Meanwhile, at the actual crossing site, dozens of miles away, real Allied forces prepared in relative silence, maintaining radio silence, camouflaging equipment, and waiting for the Ghost Army deceptions to pull German reserves away. The operation unfolded over 2 weeks. German aerial reconnaissance photographed the Ghost Army's fake preparations. German intelligence analyzed the photos and concluded that major crossing operations were imminent at multiple points. German commanders committed reserves to defend the threatened sectors. Panzer units repositioned to counterattack the expected crossings. Artillery concentrated on the fake preparation sites. The Ghost Army's positions took heavy fire. German artillery pounded locations where rubber tanks sat inflated in assault formations. The fake supply dumps became real targets. Several Ghost Army soldiers were wounded by shrapnel from artillery strikes aimed at illusions, but the deception held. German forces prepared to defend against attacks that would never come. When the real Rhine crossing launched on March 22nd, German defenses at the actual site were significantly weaker than they should have been. Units that should have been defending the real crossing were positioned miles away, waiting to repel phantom armies. The crossing succeeded with fewer casualties than expected. Allied forces established bridgeheads, pushed inland, and began the final drive into Germany. The Ghost Army's deception had worked one more time. Their final major operation of the war drew enemy forces away from critical battles, created confusion in enemy planning, and saved Allied lives through pure illusion. As Germany collapsed in April and May 1945, the Ghost Army conducted a few final small-scale operations, but their war was essentially over in July. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops boarded ships at Le Havre and sailed home to America, their extraordinary mission complete. The Ghost Army returned to the United States in July 1945 as the war in Europe ended and victory over Japan approached. They sailed into New York Harbor expecting some form of recognition for their extraordinary service. Instead, they received classification stamps and silence. The moment they disembarked, officers from Army intelligence briefed every member of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops on security protocols. Everything about their service was classified top secret. They couldn't discuss their missions. They couldn't mention the deceptions they staged. They couldn't even acknowledge they had served in the Ghost Army. Their official records would show they served in a generic headquarters unit. No details, no decorations for their specific operations, no public recognition. The men who had conducted the most successful military deceptions in history were ordered to forget they had done so. For most soldiers, this would have been deeply frustrating. But the men of the Ghost Army understood their effectiveness depended on secrecy. If future enemies learned that the Allies had successfully deceived the Wehrmacht using inflatable tanks and sound trucks, those techniques would never work again. If the methods became public, the advantage would be lost, so they kept silent. They returned to civilian life, went back to their careers in art, design, fashion, and advertising, and carried their extraordinary secret with them. Jack Macy became a celebrated designer, creating exhibits for the United States Information Agency. Bill Blass built one of America's premier fashion houses. Ellsworth Kelly became a giant of abstract expressionism, his paintings hanging in major museums worldwide. Art Kane photographed some of the most iconic images in American culture. Dozens of others became successful in their fields, bringing the creativity and innovative thinking they had honed in the Ghost Army to their civilian work. They occasionally encountered each other at art openings, fashion shows, or advertising industry events. They would recognize one another, veterans of the same strange war. Sometimes they would share a knowing look, a brief acknowledgement of the secret they both carried, but they rarely spoke about it, even to each other. The classification remained in effect. The Ghost Army's story stayed buried in classified archives for more than 5 decades. Historians writing about D-Day and the European campaign had no access to information about Operation Fortitude's tactical deceptions. Military analysts studying the Battle of the Bulge didn't know about the Ghost Army's role in the confusion that hampered German operations. The full story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops remained unknown even to most military historians. Then, in 1996, the United States Army declassified the Ghost Army files. Suddenly, researchers could access the operational records, the after-action reports, the photographs, and the personal accounts of what the 23rd had accomplished. The story began to emerge. Journalists interviewed surviving Ghost Army veterans now in their 70s. The old soldiers, finally released from their decades-long silence, shared their memories. They described inflating rubber tanks in French fields. They recalled broadcasting sound effects to fool German listening posts. They remembered the fear when German artillery targeted their fake positions and the satisfaction when intelligence confirmed their deceptions had worked. Documentary filmmakers discovered the story and recognized its extraordinary nature. In 2013, PBS broadcast The Ghost Army, a documentary that brought the unit's story to national attention. For the first time, the American public learned about the artists and designers who had fought World War II with creativity rather than firepower. The response was overwhelming. The Ghost Army story resonated because it revealed something unexpected about warfare, that imagination could be as powerful as violence, that deception could save as many lives as courage, that the paintbrush and the inflatable tank could be weapons as significant as the rifle and the artillery shell. In 2022, the United States Congress awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest civilian honors. By then, only a few veterans survived to receive it. They attended the ceremony in Washington, elderly men in their 90s, finally receiving public recognition for work they had done 8 decades earlier. Speakers at the ceremony emphasized what made the Ghost Army unique. They hadn't killed enemies, they had confused them, they hadn't destroyed targets, they had created false ones. They had won battles by making the enemy fight ghosts, and in doing so, they had saved thousands of lives on both sides. The Ghost Army's legacy extends beyond their World War II service. Their techniques, visual deception, sonic manipulation, electronic warfare, psychological operations became foundational to modern military doctrine. Every contemporary military force employs deception operations descended directly from Ghost Army innovations. The inflatable tanks may be replaced by digital deception and electronic countermeasures, but the principle remains identical. Make the enemy see what you want them to see, believe what you want them to believe, and commit forces to fight illusions while real operations proceed elsewhere. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops proved something profound about warfare in the modern age, that the most sophisticated military forces can be deceived by relatively simple illusions if those illusions are staged with sufficient creativity and understanding of how intelligence analysis works. They proved that a small unit of creative thinkers can have strategic impact far beyond their numbers. And they proved that sometimes the greatest courage isn't charging into fire, it's standing still while the enemy shoots at a rubber tank you're hiding behind, trusting that your illusion will hold, that the deception will work, that your creativity will save lives. The Ghost Army fought World War II with imagination, and they won. October 2024, a museum exhibition opens in Manhattan featuring Ghost Army artifacts, fading photographs of inflatable tanks, sketches drawn by soldier artists during operations, sound recordings preserved from the original wire spools. Among the visitors, a handful of elderly veterans, the last survivors of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, walk slowly through displays documenting their war. One of them pauses before a photograph of himself as a young man, paintbrush in hand, adding weathering details to a rubber Sherman tank in an English field. He's 99 years old now. The photograph is 80 years old, but the memory is vivid. He remembers the smell of rubber inflating in cold morning air, the sound of air compressors running through the night, the fear every time German reconnaissance aircraft appeared overhead, wondering if this time the illusion would fail, if this time the enemy would see through the deception. He remembers the satisfaction when intelligence reports confirmed German forces had been fooled, had repositioned to defend against phantom armies, had weakened their defenses at actual invasion points because they believed the ghosts were real. A young visitor approaches, reads his name tag, realizes she's standing beside a Ghost Army veteran. She asks the question everyone asks, "Did you really fool the Germans with inflatable tanks?" He smiles. "We fooled them with everything. The tanks were just props. What we really did was understand how they thought, what they expected to see, what would confirm their assumptions. Then we gave them exactly that. We didn't fight their army. We fought their intelligence analysts, and we won." That answer captures the essence of what the Ghost Army accomplished. They understood that modern warfare isn't just physical, it's informational, that battles are fought not just on terrain, but in the minds of commanders making decisions, that the side with better information makes better decisions, and the side that controls what the enemy knows controls the battlefield. The Ghost Army controlled what the Wehrmacht knew. They fed German intelligence a carefully crafted fiction, supporting it with evidence designed to pass every verification check. They understood that the more sources confirmed the same information, the more credible it became. So they created multiple confirming sources, visual, acoustic, electronic, all telling the same false story. Modern warfare would be unrecognizable to ghost army veterans. Digital deception has replaced inflatable tanks. Cyber warfare manipulates data rather than radio signals, but the principle they pioneered remains central to military strategy. Deception is a force multiplier, illusion can be weaponized, and controlling enemy perception can be as valuable as controlling enemy territory. Their story raises profound questions about the nature of warfare itself. In a conflict that killed more than 60 million people, the Ghost Army saved lives through nonviolence. They won battles without firing shots. They achieved strategic objectives through creativity rather than destruction. They suggest an alternative to the brutal arithmetic of warfare, that intelligence can defeat strength, that imagination can overcome firepower, that sometimes the greatest victory is the battle that's won without fighting. The Ghost Army's 500 men conducted more than 20 major deception operations during their service. They simulated the presence of more than 30,000 troops in various operations. They drew German forces away from critical battles. They protected real Allied units during vulnerable moments. They contributed to the success of D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, and the Rhine crossings. How many Allied soldiers lived because German artillery was firing at rubber tanks instead of real ones? How many died on beaches that should have been more heavily defended but weren't because German reserves were positioned against phantom armies? The numbers can never be calculated with precision, but even conservative estimates suggest the Ghost Army's deceptions saved thousands of lives. Their legacy isn't measured in enemies killed or territory captured. It's measured in soldiers who came home because the enemy was confused about where to fight. As the last Ghost Army veterans pass away, their story transitions from living memory to history, but it's a history with continuing relevance. In an age of deepfakes, digital manipulation, and information warfare, the lessons they taught remain critical. Perception shapes reality. Deception can be strategic, and sometimes the most effective weapon is the one that makes the enemy fight shadows. The Ghost Army proved that war can be fought and won with paintbrushes, sound effects, and imagination, that armies can be defeated by illusions, that the greatest deception of all is making the enemy believe you're strongest where you don't exist. They were soldiers who never wanted to kill anyone, and they became some of the most effective warriors of World War II.